You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 414, recorded Sunday, February 20th, 2022. Coming to you from Boise, Idaho, is me, Rachel, and co-hosting today is Bill from his home studio in Newton, Massachusetts. Hi, Bill.
Hi, Rachel.
Until nearly the end of the 19th century, the whole English language publishing industry was basically Napster for books as soon as they hit an international border where copyright protections ended. This week, we're talking about literary publishing in the US in the late 19th century and how rampant book piracy in both the United States and the United Kingdom led to the passage of the International Copyright Act of 1891, also known as the Chase Act. In the era that follows, we see the formative mergers of the dominant corporate publishing houses that are still around today, much like the other industry titans of the period we've explored in other episodes, probably most comparably our March 2021 music industry episode. We'll also discuss one of the most famous authors of the time, Mark Twain, and how piracy affected him, as well as the role of typographical unions in the passage of the Act and how they affected American sales of British authors. So first, let's get some background. At this time, the United States was basically just beginning to develop its own literary tradition, and so the nation refused to protect foreign works. As a result, American works were unprotected abroad, and domestic publishers had to compete with each other for cheap editions of foreign works. So prior to the passage of the International Copyright Act, the first national copyright law was passed in 1790 and provided a copyright protection for 14 years, but only for authors who were citizens or residents of the United States. So foreign authors and publishers were basically on their own. So to get copyright protection in the rest of the world, American authors were required to gain residency in the country in which they desired copyright protection. And one of the most famous examples is Mark Twain, who often resided in Canada when he was about to publish a book to protect his copyright in Canada. He did this pretty famously for his book, The Prince and the Pauper. So to protect foreign literature in the United States, British authors or other foreign authors would have to have an American citizen that served as kind of an agent in the publishing process, and then have the book registered in the US under this agent's name. So there was just basically the Wild West was happening. There was not copyright protection, and piracy was running rampant. And so both American and British authors and publishers joined forces to really try to lobby for a publishing treaty between the US and England. Many famous authors lent their support to this effort, such as Charles Dickens, who actually came to the US to show support for international copyright. One of the big problems was American printers were protected by a high tariff on imported works, and American printers had no wish to pay royalties to English writers or publishers, so they just were pretty happy to continue on pirating books and selling them and raking in the money and not sending that money back to the UK to the English writers or publishers. The US did discuss international copyright with Great Britain over the years. Congress requested correspondence to this effect in 1842, and there were many bills that were proposed, but none of them ever really went anywhere. So only works published in the US could be restricted with copyright. And so authors including Mark Twain, as we mentioned, Louisa May Alcott, Edward Eggleston, and Bill Nye, not the science guy, wrote letters in the mid-1880s to the Century magazine requesting this international copyright. These letters to these public journals had a strong effect on the issue, as well as the American Copyright League, which was formed in 1883, and it was a lobbying group of authors and publishers that came together and were really pushing to get a bill passed that would create these mutual copyright protection treaties with foreign countries. The League was a great supporter of an international copyright, and specifically the Chase Act, and they conducted a reading at the Madison Square Theater in 1885, and they sponsored readings by American authors in aid of the League's cause. So they were really pushing to get this Copyright Act enacted. And in 1885, a United States Senator, Joseph Roswell Hawley, introduced a bill aimed at extending copyright to foreign authors for consideration by Congress. His bill was ultimately unsuccessful, but Mark Twain, being a Connecticut Connecticut man himself and a neighbor to Senator Hawley, really involved himself in the lobbying process, and he influenced then President Grover Cleveland's thinking on the matter. So then Cleveland asked Congress for legislation to create this Copyright Act in his State of the Union address in December of 1885. As you may note, the Copyright Act did not get passed until 1891, so there was a long period where there was a lot of efforts being made to create this act and get it passed through Congress, but it just kind of died out and needed to be like reintroduced and worked on and tweaked. And eventually, in 1891, it did get passed. Now, we've mentioned Mark Twain a few different times, and there's a sort of mythology that Mark Twain was bankrupted by these pirated sales that cost him revenue, especially by Canadian printers who could also get copies into U.S. markets and undercut the American printers. And while it's true he did lose a significant amount of royalties this way, he actually went into bankruptcy because he was a horrible investor and lost all his money, and his wife's, on a couple pretty bad bets related to the publishing industry. So, had he received those royalties, he probably would have just lost those as well. He did get involved in the issue to some degree before the 1891 Act, including making visits to Canada specifically for the purposes of in-person registration of his copyrights there to try to reduce piracy by Canadian printers that often shipped royalty-free copies to the northern U.S. We probably also discussed his bankruptcy on a different episode at some point, particularly Twain's period of trying to straighten out his finances with the help of the guy from Standard Oil. That bankruptcy did happen after the 1891 legislation, so his lack of royalties didn't really have a bearing on his financial woes. There was a U.S. Patent and Trademark Office government article. I found an article about Mark Twain's copyright fight on the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office government website, and it kind of talks about his efforts both prior to the 1891 legislation and his efforts after the 1891 legislation to enact further protections and extend copyright to authors even after their death. So prior to the 1891 Copyright Act, like we said before, he did support Senator Hawley's bill. He even testified in its favor before the Senate Committee on Patents, and he also lobbied to President Grover Cleveland himself. He wrote to the president, quote, "Although a most worthy cause has failed once more, we who are interested have one large consolation, that the country has at last had a resident who appreciated its importance." And even after the passage of the Chase Act, he still lobbied for the extension of copyright both in the UK and the US. In 1900, Clemens actually appeared before a committee of Britain's House of Lords to testify in favor of copyright protection. And he told his story later during his 1906 quote-unquote white suit speech in front of the US Congress. He kind of wore his trademark white flannel suit that you see in pictures of Mark Twain. And it's kind of his typical outfit. It's what you picture when you picture Mark Twain. And I think it was kind of made famous in the Star Trek Next Generation episode where I think Data goes on the holodeck and meets Mark Twain. So it's kind of the iconic image of Mark Twain. And he wore this white suit before Congress. Like I said, he referenced his 1900 House of Lords speech during his 1906 congressional speech. Quote, "When I appeared before that committee of the House of Lords, the chairman asked me what limit I would propose. I said, perpetuity. I could see some resentment in his manner, and he said the idea was illogical, for the reason that has long ago been decided that there can be no such thing as property in ideas. I said there was property in ideas before Queen Anne's time. They had perpetual copyright. He said, what is a book? A book is just built from base to roof on ideas, and there can be no property in it. I said I wished he could mention any kind of property on this planet that had a pecuniary value which was not derived from an idea or ideas." By December 1906, Clemens, or Mark Twain, was willing to settle for less than perpetuity. Speaking in his glowing garb before the Committee on Patents of the Senate and the House, he hoped to see the 42-year copyright period extended to the author's life and 50 years afterward. 4 years later, in 1910, Clemens was out of the struggle. By then, he had seen and praised the passage of the Copyright Act of 1909, which allowed for renewal of copyright, bringing it to a total of 56 years. It was not until 1976 that American authors were finally granted Mark Twain's life and 50 years afterward. And that's kind of made famous by his publishing of his autobiography, which famously happened after all the copyrights on his works expired. So it's kind of interesting to see how copyright really affected Mark Twain's life and his legacy. It was really an important part of his creative efforts to make sure that his copyright was recognized and that his copyright was held even after his death, because he was really worried. By this time, he was in his 70s, and he was worried about having assets that he could pass on to his children after his death. So the fact that he could pass on those rights to his children would ensure a little bit of income for them as well. So I found a few different articles from bibliographical societies and journals that really detailed the 1891 Copyright Act, the passage of it and the lobbying that happened to get it passed, as well as some of the effects of the passage of the act, especially in regards to typesetting and the publishing of works in the United States. Even publishing of foreign works had to be published in the U.S. to carry U.S. copyright. So I found a few different articles that discuss this. So first, I found the 1891 International Copyright Act Lobbying Behind the Scenes article by James J. Barnes, and it was published in the Papers of the Bibliographical Society of America in September of 2021. So prior to the act getting passed, as we said before, authors and publishers on both sides of the Atlantic were anxious to get some form of copyright protection passed. Despite the urgency from the publishing industry, Congress wasn't moved by their pleas. Quoting from the article, 2 Anglo-American copyright treaties were introduced in the U.S. Senate in 1853-1854 and 1880-1881 sessions, where they had the advantage of not requiring approval by both houses of Congress, but only 2/3 of the members of the Senate. However, neither succeeded. Additionally, 11 bills granting international copyright were introduced between 1843 and 1886, but all failed to rally sufficient support. So despite the publishing industry really urgently pressing the matter, really trying to get these copyright treaties passed, Congress just really didn't budge on the issue. And like we said before, piracy was rampant, so as well as Mark Twain's works getting pirated, Americans pirated nearly all of Charles Dickens's work, while British people were reading pirated editions of American authors, such as James Fenimore Cooper and Washington Irving. And quoting again from the article, especially noteworthy was the wholesale reprinting in Britain of more than 1 million copies of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was famous at the time for its abolitionist viewpoint and really bringing up the abolitionist view and kind of galvanizing the public in anti-slavery sentiment. Meanwhile, many European nations were signing agreements that set up reciprocal copyright protections. Quoting again, in 1886, the United States sent an observer to Bern, Switzerland, where 10 countries, Great Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Switzerland, Italy, Haiti, Liberia, and Tunisia, met and agreed to establish mutual copyright protection. But Congress showed little interest in joining the convention, and so we were left out of those mutual copyright protection agreements. And so, again, piracy just proliferated, and Congress just basically showed no interest in changing this. So as I mentioned before, American authors and publishers formed a lobbying group in 1883 with the goal of getting a law passed. They called themselves the American Copyright League, and many prominent authors joined. So 2 bills that the League gave their support to were Connecticut Senator Joseph Roswell Hawley's, which was introduced in January 6, 1885, and Rhode Island Senator Jonathan Chase's, which was introduced a year later on January 21, 1886. Quoting again from the article, both bills, Hawley's and Chase's, were referred to the Senate Committee on Patents, widely acknowledged as a legislative graveyard. Surprisingly, they were given joint hearings on the 28th and 29th of January, the 12th of March, and April 11th, 1886, and the Chase Bill was recommended, whereas the committee was mute concerning the Hawley Bill. The League ultimately gave their official endorsement to the Chase Bill due to inclusion of a manufacturing clause, where any copyrighted work had to be printed in the United States, which the League recognized as crucial to the bill's passing because the backing of the typographical unions was needed. And although it took several years and a couple reintroductions into the Senate, Chase's Act finally passed March 3, 1891, and went into effect July 1st, 1891. And so what were the effects of it? What did it do? So I found another article called The Chase Act in Anglo-American Literary Relations by James L.W. West III, and it was published in Studies in Bibliography in 1992. So quoting from this article, the practical effect of the Chase Act was to require American publishers to decide early in the game whether they wished to issue a British title in a copyrighted edition in the States. If a British book were apt to do well on the American market, it was necessary to protect it by copyright. This meant that the American publisher had to invest his own capital and have the book manufactured by domestic typesetters and printers. If a British book were expected to sell only moderately well in America, copies could still be imported from the British publisher, or less frequently, plates could be sent over, but the book, when issued, would be in the public domain. This made both British and American publishers hesitate over marginal titles. The effect over the long term, according to British publisher Stanley Unwin, was that only about 5% of the books published in Great Britain, exclusive of fiction, were also published and copyrighted in separate editions by American publishers. Consignments of other British books, printed from type set in Great Britain, were handled by American publishers and distributors in small quantities, but the numbers were not significant enough to make a very great difference to British houses. Thus, the American printing industry was protected from British competition, and the American book market remained relatively inaccessible to British publishers. So both American and British publishers were kind of stuck to pick the winners and the losers. So known authors who had name recognition and were able to sell books were kind of favored over unknown authors or books that were not predicted to sell very well. So it kind of created this winners and losers system. The only British publishers to benefit markedly from the Chase Act were those who had offices on both sides of the Atlantic. For example, John Lane, founder of the Bodley Head, used the new law to considerable advantage. He opened a New York branch in 1896. Thereafter, any of his titles with potential for both the British and American markets were manufactured in the United States and copyrighted in Washington, while overrun sheets were sent to England, bound there, and copyrighted for the British market. Lane thus avoided the expense of a separate British typesetting. A somewhat less severe effect of the Chase Act was to impose a modified system of British spelling on many books that were manufactured in the United States. American readers, as a rule, seem not to have been particularly sensitive to British orthography and usage. Thus it appears to have had little effect on the reception or sales of a book in America if it were printed from British plates or composed of overrun British sheets. Such books were not protected by U.S. copyright, as noted earlier. The reverse, however, was not true. British reviewers and readers apparently did complain if books with American spelling and usage were sold to them in British bookstores. American literary agents, who did a good bit of transatlantic business, were very much aware of the problem. New York agent Paul Revere Reynolds, writing to publisher Henry Holt in March 1897, for example, specified that a book destined for joint American-British publication must be set with English spelling. Reynolds added, quote, "This is absolutely essential as Heinemann is not willing to take a book except on those conditions. Otherwise, English reviewers slash a book and hurt its sale," end quote. The British authors most seriously damaged by the manufacturing clause were young writers who were as yet without reputation in America. In order to secure U.S. copyright for the books of these authors, American publishers ideally had to decide before publication to have the text set and printed in the States. For unknown authors, however, this was impractical and financially risky. If, therefore, a book blossomed late in England and an author's potential in the American market were consequently recognized only after a small consignment of British set copies had been imported and sold in the States, then there was no way ever to secure copyright for that writing in America. The author's early work was in public domain, available to any publisher. Even if the author had a subsequent copyrighted success in the US, his early writing remained unprotected and was sure to be pirated. So the act, as imperfect as it was, didn't tamp down completely on piracy. It just restricted it pretty significantly. But as we mentioned, a marginal author, a British author that didn't have success early in their career, would still be at risk of having their early work being pirated as it was in the public domain in the United States, and therefore not under the protection of the Act. So, as we mentioned, the 1891 Act first created these mutual protections with the Swiss signatories like Belgium, France, Switzerland, and Great Britain in 1891. And then subsequently, over the next about decade and a half, more countries were added to these protection agreements. So in 1892, the German Empire and Italy joined the protection agreements. In 1893, Denmark and Portugal, 1895, Spain, 1896, Mexico and Chile, 1899, Costa Rica and the Netherlands, in 1903, Cuba, and finally in 1905, Norway. So it kind of slowly and gradually added these mutual copyright protections with other countries, I guess kind of as diplomatic agreements came up amongst the literary publishers. And kind of interesting that we took so long compared to like other countries. As I mentioned, the Swiss agreement happened in the 1880s. And so we were kind of really behind the curve for these copyright protections. And it seems to be kind of a misguided industrial protection stance for the reasoning. But it didn't really seem to work very well in effect because these agreements these polite agreements were what made piracy less of an issue. And so the fact that we wouldn't enter into these agreements just really left American authors high and dry and at risk for having their foreign royalties stolen, basically. So it's kind of interesting that it took us so long to enter into these kind of polite agreements with other countries and offer these foreign copyright protections.
I think it's sort of interesting, the sequence after the initial signatories about which countries got added in which order, because, of course, mostly what we've been talking about so far in this episode, understandably, has been the English language published media, and that, of course, the two sort of poles of that at the time were Britain and the United States, London and New York, and that is obviously a significant factor of the reading public in the United States, but it's not the only reading public in the United States at this time. And we know that we had large literate populations of Germans and Italians, so notable that those were the next two after the initial round of multilateral reciprocity. And then we start seeing the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, and then eventually Norway. We see, Portugal and Spain and Mexico sort of encompassing some of these immigrants from the various Spanish-speaking countries and so on and so forth. So I thought that was kind of an interesting phenomenon. I do agree with you, and something that I was speculating while you were reading through all of this material was about the tariff role, because you mentioned that a couple points that especially, this is something that they'd been trying for decades to get unsuccessfully to get past some sort of copyright reciprocity, and that there were certain printers who felt like they didn't really care because they were protected in certain ways by the import tariffs and so forth. And so, that was probably, I'm guessing, the printers who weren't the ones being hurt on the other side, right? They were the ones who were circulating the pirated copies. They would have been like, yeah, well, doesn't really affect us, so let's just keep this going. But when you get to the late 1880s and then into the early 1890s, sort of the central political battle that's happening up until actually, I guess also even past that point, because it becomes a debate over the solution. I was going to say the panic of 1893 and the long depression that happens at that point, which we've actually done a whole episode on, the sort of central political battle between Democrats and Republicans, and to some extent within the Democratic Party in this period, is this battle over the protective tariff, the federal import tariff. And Cleveland and his allied Democrats are making the case that the tariff needs to be either sharply reduced, if not outright eliminated. And McKinley is saying, no, we need to maintain this really high tariff for various industrial reasons, but also for revenue. And, when the recession happens, he's arguing that the tariff is the solution. And it wasn't, he had some more nuanced views than just that, but that was sort of this crucial battle line that's happening. And the Democrats took Congress back in 1890, which was just ahead of this act, although they had lost the White House for that one term between Cleveland's two non-consecutive terms. So it didn't seem to me to be spelled out in the sources that we were talking about that the vulnerability of the tariff for the first time in decades may have been sort of the foot in the door to be able to actually pass this. I don't know if that's consistent with what you had read, but that's something I was speculating as you were talking about this.
That definitely makes sense to me, because the references to the tariff were kind of that big obstacle to the passage, as well as the industrial union. So I think it was just a case of who was being loudest and lobbying the loudest, and who Congress finally wanted to listen to. So I'm wondering if maybe the printing industry initially was the greater lobby, the louder lobby, and they did get the concession that the typographical unions wanted, that copyrighted works had to be printed in the U.S., but maybe the authors and the publishers finally got their foot in the door, got the ear of Congress, and were able to make their case that they needed these considerations put in place as well.
Well, and also the typographical union's demand fits with trying to deal with the prospect of a reduced or possibly eliminated tariff. It ended up being reduced and then raised again, so it wasn't at that point eliminated. But the possibility was probably there that they could have said, okay, we have copyright reciprocity now, and all of the books are going to be, all of the British books are going to be printed in England and then shipped overseas, on a transport ship and sold in the United States, because there's now this removal of this tariff protection, if that had ended up happening. And the typographical union is saying, no, it has to be printed here. Even if it's a British copyright, they have to have an operation here to print it, or contract someone to do it. And in that sense, that aligns the interests of the union with the American printers. And this is a way of dealing with the possibility that the tariff protections aren't going to be there anymore.
Right. That's a really good point. Another just kind of funny aspect of it that I found amusing was that Americans were pretty okay with British type spellings, and that just it didn't happen the other way around. British people were extremely mad about American spellings and turns of phrase and whatnot. I found that pretty amusing.
Yeah, that was funny. So, as we've now alluded to quite a few times, the two poles here are England and the United States when we're talking about English language publishing media at this time. And the question is, how are these companies going to handle this? So we've just talked about this idea of, yes, we'll recognize the copyrights, but you have to print them in the United States, that kind of thing, right? So this brings us to a question of the corporate organization of these enterprises after this copyright reform, or around the time of this reform, because that had been interesting to me, especially as Rachel mentioned at the beginning of the episode, in comparison to the music industry, which is another thing that is a literal industry in the time period that we're talking about. There are industrial processes, physical processes, and so forth, but the product is largely an intellectual property matter. And, how do you deal with that? What are the sort of ways that the corporations organize themselves? That was something that was interesting to me and prompted me to look into the topic that we're discussing today about the copyright reform in 1891. And so I did find an article because, when we talked about the music industry episode, we kind of went through and said, okay, these are the major publishing companies and what their origins are in terms of the music industry and, the record labels and everything. But we were kind of focusing on these huge music studios. And so I was curious about what the situation was and whether it was a similar phenomenon in the publishing industry where the same companies are still around in the same way that the same music companies are still around. And basically that is mostly the case. They've obviously had various mergers and reorganizations and so forth over the years, but you can kind of trace back those. So I had found an article from 2017 where they went through, there was a table of the, at the time, big five publishing companies, and they of course have many little imprints and subsidiaries, many of which used to be independent companies that got taken over. The big five is now not the big five anymore because since this article, there was yet another one of these corporate mega mergers, which, by the way, is probably a topic coming up in its own right as an episode soon, is just the issue of corporate mega mergers in general and kind of the history there. But of course, as we've been talking about, this is something that kind of dates to this period of the 1870s through the 1890s is the start of these big corporate mergers. So the article, as I said, includes a table of origins for the major publishing conglomerates, some of which were American, some of which were British, and in many cases existed as, or today I should say exist, as mergers of companies from both countries. And this is done for the reasons that we've talked about, to facilitate control of the markets and rights in both centers of the English language world. These companies originate in either the early 19th or early 20th centuries. Basically, there was one wave of companies that began in the first Industrial Revolution period, so that would be 18 teens through the 1840s or so. And then they kind of merged to form the modern multi-state or multinational corporations around the time of these international copyright reforms. Then there was another wave of companies formed in the 1920s or 1930s alongside further evolutions of the industry and mass market production of written consumer goods beyond books and newspapers. So just to quickly rattle off from this article that will be linked in the notes at arsenalfordemocracy.com, HarperCollins comes from Harper from 1817 in New York City. Collins is from a British publisher. Hachette, that was, that's a 2006 company. But if you actually break down all the different constituent parts that created that big merger, you get back to 1837, Little Brown and Company from Boston, Massachusetts. And then Macmillan, that was a Scottish company from 1843, but they actually had a U.S. office as early as 1869. Penguin Books was a UK company from the 1930s. That's part of Penguin Random House now. Random House from that same general time period, 1927, but from the New York side of things. Those merged together in 2013. And then Simon & Schuster was a New York City publisher, also from the 1920s, and they had started out as, quote, a fad publisher of crossword puzzle books, and then got into paperbacks in a big way. And, that's, of course, another huge development in the industry is paperbacks, which we are not focusing on in today's episode. As I said, this was the big five companies as of several years ago now, which is down to big four as these corporate mega mergers continue. As I've sort of been dancing around here, we've talked a lot in past episodes about the rise of the modern corporation in the environment of the post-Civil War United States, where corporations for the first time existed across state lines and then across national borders, as transportation and communication costs, as well as legal and financial reforms, made these reorganizations possible for the first time. And these titans proceeded to drive the competition out of business or buy it up, following the Standard Oil model, which we talked about. For this industry, copyright or anti-piracy reforms are presumably one of the big keys, at least on the legal side, to allowing the formation of what we would consider the recognizable modern big corporate publishing houses, which, as we just talked about, still exist in some form or another to present day. And of course, the urgency of those reforms got greater and greater as the physical production material costs continued to drop with the mid-19th century invention of cheaper paper and the 1880s invention of linotype machines, and so on and so forth. In terms of market demand, literacy would have been quite widespread already, of course, in the US, but still growing, and consumer advertising was taking off, as we discussed in our canned foods episode. This new focus on copyright law reform tracks with the overall trend over several centuries where unauthorized copying of books effectively either didn't happen or, due to vanishingly low volume, didn't really matter until the printing press in the 1400s, and then it would matter more and more as costs kept dropping. And there's actually an interesting chapter specifically on the printing industry in the Renaissance period in Patrick Wyman's The Verge, talking about sort of the economics of that whole process, and it was very expensive and very risky and so forth. And that is, you can start to see the very early seeds of how this is potentially going to become a problem, but it's still not really a problem for quite a while. But by the first industrial revolution, the 19th century, and especially the mid-19th century, we're starting to see some pretty significant problems emerging. And they can recognize that, but it's not going to be successful immediately until it really reaches this crisis point, and there are various opportunities that align to make this politically feasible to adopt, as we've just talked about earlier in the episode. And so because of these factors getting more significant, right? The piracy becoming more prevalent, the communication and transportation speeds increasing so that you can send these pirated copies further afield and faster, things like that, right? All of these factors are evolving over the period, and so the situation is becoming more and more urgent, therefore leading to a more political pressure to get something done. That's why it doesn't happen immediately, earlier in the first industrial revolution, and it doesn't even happen at the beginning of the second industrial revolution. It really takes quite a long time, but you can see all of these different sort of features of the industry stacking on top of each other to create this burst of reform finally breaking through, and then to have this unfolding period of the start of consolidation of modern multi-state and multinational corporate publishing houses. So Rachel, I'll turn it over to you for any final thoughts and to wrap up the episode.
Just wanted to go back to the major publishing houses that you mentioned and how a lot of them were mergers from both U.S. and U.K. publishing houses coming together. So it seems like that was like one of the two major strategies. The other one that I mentioned in that article about publishing, or it was just British companies coming over and establishing U.S. Operation centers, basically. So it's kind of interesting to see how the publishing houses on both sides of the Atlantic kind of adapted and learned to kind of follow the law, but also make sure they were coming out to the best advantage. So I think that does it for today. This was a really great episode. I found out a lot about the publishing industry that I previously didn't know. I hope you enjoyed this as well. Thanks for recording with me, Bill.
Yeah, thanks.